Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the early afternoon session of this conference. If anybody feels that he does not see me, maybe he has lost his eyeglasses. They are lying here. I am Ella Landau-Tasseron. I was asked by organizers to chair this session, which I'll do presently. I thank the organizers for the honor. We have a session about Islamic martyrdom, and I may add in modern times, not a classical one. We have three lectures. One explores martyrdom on the personal level or the psychological level. That would be Dr. Anat Berko. The second and third lectures approach martyrdom in terms of both functional and ideological approach, how it is described in order to mobilize people, what role it played in or plays in the agenda of a movement. We'll hear all that from the speakers here. The first one is Dr. Anat Berko, who is a research fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at the Interdisciplinary Center, Herzliya. She also conducts research for the National Security Council. She holds a PhD in criminology. That is, she is not our field, but that may be for the better. And in 2008-9, she was a visiting professor at George Washington University. Her research areas are Palestinian suicide terrorism, imprisonment in both military and civilian prisons, and women in the IDF. She is the author of The Path to Paradise, The Inner World of Suicide Bombers and Their Dispatchers, and she has conducted interviews with suicide bombers who had failed their missions. Obviously, had they succeeded, she would not have conducted interviews, as well as with their dispatchers and directors, including Hamas spiritual leader Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. She will now speak about the inner world of suicide bombers and their dispatchers. And I step down with your permission because there is a PowerPoint.
Thank you, Professor Landau. Okay, I'm not going to speak about the revolution or the intifada or the uprising, but first-hand research about suicide bombers and their dispatchers, about the inner world of those people, how they feel, how they talk, try to give a, not profile, but something about them. For us, actually, to speak about suicide, to committing suicide is something that we're talking in psychological meaning about a pain, a psychological pain that the men who committing suicide want to put an end to this pain. When we are speaking about istishhad, self-sacrifice, it's not the same process, because for him, it's not such a pain that you want to put an end to, but rather something that he does to get something much better in paradise, in the next world, because it's much better for him to be there. In 1996, I met with Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the spiritual and operative leader of the Hamas organization, and I asked Yassin about, it was, after we had here in Israel so many suicide bombers, and I asked him about the Shahada and about Istishhad and about women in this Amaliyah. And he said, for me, women has to do just one thing, to bear children. We have enough people, enough male to carry out suicide terrorism. But this is the excellent way to fight, and this is also the excellent way to solve problems to people, for our people. And he meant the people who collaborate with the Israeli, so he gave them the opportunity to clear their names in this way. I think that if I'll read something very short that one female suicide bomber told me in prison, it will get us inside their way of thinking. There are girls who volunteer. I didn't offer myself. I did not want to die in terrorist attack. About 3 months before the attack, I began training. I didn't know it was going to turn like this. I didn't think I would die, and I didn't want to die. They, the recruiters and the dispatchers, planned for my suicide, but I didn't request that. They offered me explosive belts or other means, but I didn't agree. At first, they didn't force me, but the situation progressed and reached the point it reached. I was a spoiled child. I hadn't planned on dying. And after that, she described how she begged the dispatcher to cancel the whole thing because she's not observant Muslim, and she listened to song and watched television. And she said, if I only knew that I'm going to be a shahida, I could, conduct myself in another way. And he said, Khalas ya binti, you're going to do it. You must do it. You know us. We know you. And that's it. So a young girl, a young woman who just wants thrill and adventures, an opportunity to meet with the shabab, with the opposite sex, something that's considered taboo in this society, find herself as a female suicide bomber, although she didn't really plan on this. And when I asked her why you didn't go to your father and ask for help, and she said, if I only went to my father, he could kill me for having those meetings with the shabab. So for her to get out from the boring house and to meet with the opposite sex, it was a great opportunity for her. But after that, it was a non-shareable secret, and she couldn't really go back to her house. About Sheikh Yassin, going back to him. Sheikh Yassin, when I asked him about the relation between the West and Islam, he said that it's like a bee and a flower. She can suck the nectar, which means that to take all the benefits and the technologies that the West can offer, but after that, smash the flower. We reject all the culture and the way how women conduct themselves in the West. All the women in his eyes are whores and things like that. And when I asked him if he could send his own daughter, to give lectures or to be a professor, he said, yes, my own daughter can do it, but she cannot give any lecture when she's naked. So in his eyes, it was like when you're a female professor in the West, you give your talks when you're naked or something like this. The other thing that he said when I asked him, could you really let your son, one of your sons or daughters, to get up in the bus and explode himself as a shaheed? And he said, he was embarrassed, and he said, if he would like to do so, it's okay. So I asked if there is any limit of an age for this amaliyah, and he said, just from the age of 15. But if the boy is like he looks older than that, and he has the physical appearance of a man, he can do it before that. And we saw also children that really did it. For Yassin, it was a matter, we can choose. If you want to choose to live in a small house here in this world, 2 bedrooms and that's it, or you can choose to have your villa with dunams of flowers and garden and everything, and which means Jannah. And he asked me, what do you think about it? And I told him, for me, it's a matter of death or life. If I can live in such a house, it will be wonderful. But for him, it was the next word and not in this word. When we are talking about shaheeds, I think that we need to separate the question and to ask ourselves if there is any man or woman that wake up in the morning and say, this is the day that I'm going to carry out istishhad. Never. They need somebody to dispatch them. And the dispatcher are the key leaders and the key for these operations. Nobody can do it without a dispatcher, without the guy who dispatch him, and sometimes the same guy who recruit them and dispatch them. And I can tell you just in 2 words about the dispatchers that for them, when I spoke with a guy with 48 life sentence about recruiting this suicide bomber, shaheeds, potential shaheeds, he said, I'm looking for sad guys. And he knows exactly where to look for them. And also, many shaheeds come, potential shaheeds, and volunteer to be shaheeds. And there is infinite number of people who would be suicide bombers. It's not a problem to find them. And it's not a problem to find female or children to carry out such an act. The dispatchers are actually are the gun who just shoot the bullets. And the suicide bombers are just the bullets and not more than that. And you can see it also in prison that they don't have such a special status in prison. The dispatchers are much more important than them. They are just the bullets. Who are those people, the suicide bombers? We are speaking about anti-heroes. They are not the heroes of this society. Socially marginalized people lacking self-esteem that need recognition, if not in their lifetime, so after their death. And very introverted and easily recruited by significant others. And we're speaking about a revolution of youth right now, right? So the patriarchal family is not the same like it was before. The status of the father in the family, sometimes he cannot provide for his family. So the children looking for other figures to emulate and also to admire because the father is not there. The father is not there sometimes because he married 3 women. I met with the deputy of the prime minister of the Hamas 2 years ago, Alshech and he said, I have 3 women, and just when I'm in jail, they argue. There is a lot of fitna inside the family because they have more than 1 wife. And it's great, even bin Laden, who was the son of the Syrian mother, the rejected mother that his father divorced her. He was raised by his brother. So the problem is there that the figure of the father is very weak. And sometimes it's easy to recruit from the family suicide bombers, potential suicide bombers, and even females. And we know how they are so sensitive about the honor of the family that they have the link to the honor of their daughters and sisters. And I know that people think that the mother is not such an influential figure in the patriarchal family. But emotionally, the mother is very important, very deep inside. I could see it with people who, like serial killer by proxy, and when I spoke with them about Ummi, my mother, about that figure of the mother, they could cry. They came up to tears. So if we are speaking about emotionals, even one time there was a siege around the house of a wanted guy from the Hamas, And the mother asked the Israeli soldier to speak via the megaphone and to call her son to get out without shooting. And after she called him, Ya Ibni, and I don't want you to get hurt, and he went out of the house just with underwear, like a 5-year-old boy, without shooting even one bullet, because his mother told him. So the mother is a very important figure. For the Shaheeds, it's a feeling of omnipotent. He feels like Allah. There was a female suicide bomber who told me that she spoke with the IDF soldier that escorted her in the military court, and she told him, but I changed my mind. I didn't hurt you. I think that you need to release me. I gave you life. You're not Allah. You didn't give life. You didn't murder, but you didn't give life. So the feeling that they can do everything, they can choose who will live and who will die, it's something that gives them a lot of power, empower them. And the other thing that I can take from the criminology, from criminals, is the duda, the dig inside the mind, the worm, like junkies, like drug addicts that say, oh, you must do it, you must do it, you must do it. When they start to think about istishhad, it's become obsessive compulsive way of thinking that they must do it until the explosion, that they will not really have any rest. They believe that they redeemed the clan owner, and also they saved the 70 people from the family from the torture in the grave, inside the grave. They will have direct path to paradise without the suffering in the grave. 70 people. I asked one female suicide bomber that told me that her brother was a shaheed, and he exploded himself in Tel Aviv. So I asked her, why you need to be a shahida? You have already 70 places in Jannah. And she said, but we are a very big family. So it's like, and she really believes that this is the case, that we are a very big family, so I must do it. Also, the organization gives them a sense of belonging and collective identity. And I know that many people will say, oh, they are crazy people, and it's a matter of mental illness. It's not a pathology. We can find some people with borderline personality, but they are not sick. It's not a mental illness. They know what is right and what is wrong, but there is something that can change their minds. If they will see something on their way and they wouldn't be able to dehumanize or delegitimize the victim, they won't do it. For example, one female suicide bomber that went to carry out suicide attack with another guy, 16-year-old boy, and he exploded himself, and she went in a city, it was in Rishon LeZion, and she saw a baby in a carriage, and the baby looks like her nephew. And she thought, Allah will not forgive me if I'll kill my nephew or this baby. She could see him as a baby. Something that the terrorists that carry out the slaughter in Itamar settlements couldn't see. They could see the babies as a soldier that will be after 18 years. So if this robotic behavior and tunnel vision when they go to the target will interact with something, they won't do it, they will change their minds. Also, the other thing is that they perceive things in black and white, and they act in impulsive way, and they want to really to please the other. A young boy that went to carry out a suicide attack in Hawara checkpoint, and he said, my classmate asked me to do it, and I told him, Ma'alesh, I'll do it. for sure, he asked him, and all the group of the students from his class were around him. So peer group pressure, and he couldn't really change his mind. The other thing is to restore loss of honor. Instead of honor killing, it's much better to be sometimes a shahida than to be a sharmuta. And we know this. And it's a good solution in a situation that a girl, especially a girl that can be a victim of honor killing, can solve a problem and not to humiliate herself or her family. So it's a great solution. And the other thing is the image that they have inside their heads, that they are going to be the heroes. Songs will be there, posters, television, they will get this recognition, and it's very important for them. Okay, I'll run now. I'm speaking about the Shahada mania. It's, I think it's a terminology that we can use. And, okay, just a few things that shaheeds for Allah, I could give myself, I can give everything just to have the Hurriyat al-Ayn, just to have the virgins, and they really believe that virgins. In America, somebody told me that there are Virginians actually that waiting there, but they really feel like they have the experience with the virgins, and sometimes it's a male virgins that want to get the female virgins. Speaking about everything that is forbidden in this world is allowed in paradise. Sex, beer, not wine even, he's young, beer, and to see the face of Allah and the Prophet, and to be with the virgins, eternal virgin with white skin that you can see the veins through the skins, eternal virginity, no physical needs, no period, they don't need to go to the bathroom, no headache, nothing. Everything is okay. Okay, I felt that I was a man and not weak. I had power. And he told me he was a male virgin that wanted to be with the female virgin. What about the female suicide bombers? For them, it's something else, actually. They have the opportunity to get out of the house, and also there is no back. But they will never get the same recognition that the males will get. That will be question mark above their heads why they did it, what wrong she did, and cause her to carry out a suicide attack. This is a self-portrait of female suicide bomber. Look at the image of the body, like a box, like abused child, with no flesh inside. And no flesh, just to say that many times when I spoke with Sheikh, Honorable Sheikh, about this phenomenon, they said, no, women shouldn't carry out istishhad. Why? Because after they blow themselves up, it's aura. You can see their body parts, and sometimes intimate body parts. So even after her death, she doesn't have anything with her body. The family own the body, the males own the body, and it's aura, so she cannot do it. Here it's not the head, it's not it's the hijab, it's not even the hair. And this is the image, and it's not 5-year-old sketch, but a 21-year-old. What about here? The males. You see the sexuality repressed, and a lot of things. The image of the man, he doesn't look, and the macho pose, and we could talk about them. Okay. Just 2 minutes. The dispatchers and the suicide bombers, they humanize their victims. There is a splitting inside them that for us the challenge is to break this splitting. In one hand, they can live normative life, but on the other, when they have to carry out terror attacks, they don't see the victims as real victims. It's a competition who is the victim. The mothers and the father are against this phenomena. but after that, they have to serve the baklawas and to say, oh, we are very happy, and to express their happiness. They even cannot cry. But after they shut the cameras, they cry and curse the dispatchers. They send their own children to study abroad and send their children, the private children, to blow themselves up. About children, they are just the nothing, they are just the change, and they do it without kill any Jews. So nothing speaking about the child himself, about abuse of the children. And I think that this social worker did gave an excellent expression that the family exposed now, and the chat rooms, and even the girls that told me that they spoke with, one famous suicide bomber told me, I spoke with a guy from Kuwait, my lover. She didn't meet him even one time. So the way to be able to communicate with people through the chat rooms, through the Facebook, and to see everything on television, and to have all those realities program in Lebanon and other places, and at the same time everything is a shame to do, and especially for the girls, put them in a conflict that they cannot bear. So for children that play in the streets with a face concealed with the mask, and when you ask them, what do you want to be? The child that collects pictures of shaheeds like stamps, or like pictures of singers or football heroes, and you ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? For him is to be a shaheed or not to be. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Anat, for a glimpse into the minds of these people. And we now move to the outer phase of this phenomenon with Dr. Eli Alshech. Eli Alshech received his PhD in Islamic legal thought in Princeton University. He taught at UCLA and later was the director of Jihad and Terrorism Studies project at the Middle East Media Research Institute, the MEMRI. He is now conducting independent research pertaining to global jihad ideologies and to cyber jihad. He will now speak about Salafi-Jihadi martyrdom. Is it a means or an end? Please, Eli.
Good afternoon. I'm going to take you to a different part of the world, from our area, from Palestine/Israel. I'll take you now to the area of Saudi Arabia, and where things with Salafi-Jihadi, or between Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, where the roots of Salafi-Jihadi, or the ideology of global jihad, start to grow. The violence promoted in Saudi Arabia by the adherents of the Salafi-Jihadi creed, this is the ideology of global jihad, of Al-Qaeda, culminated in the Riyadh bombings in 2003. This was the big attack against the compound of the Americans or foreigners in Saudi Arabia. The violence created an open rift between traditional non-jihadi Salafis, many of whom are scholars, and members of the Salafi-Jihadi camp. Underlying the conflict was the debate of how to transform Islamic society and rescue it from what both camps, meaning the jihadi and non-jihadi Salafi camps, viewed as imminent spiritual annihilation. Whereas followers of the Salafi-Jihadi camp believed that all means are justified in the way to bringing about the urgent change, traditional Salafis perceived indiscriminate killing and violence against Muslims as red lines which must not be crossed. Hence, they denounced the jihadist policies outright and portrayed their struggle as lying outside the legitimate boundaries of jihad. With prominent Salafi scholars against them, Salafi-Jihadi jihadis needed to find ways to carve out their own legitimacy or else run the risk of losing social support. And this is a critical point. It was very difficult, and it still is very difficult to raise money in Saudi Arabia for acts of martyrdom unless they are approved by scholars. Elsewhere, I have shown that since Salafi jihadis could not compete with scholarly credentials and learning qualifications of their rivals, meaning the traditional non-jihadi scholars, they chose to base their claims of legitimacy on the Weberian notion of religious charisma. By this I mean not the charismatic person we talk about today, but the superhuman or person with superpowers or special powers. Salafi jihadis constructed the charismatic image of jihadists in several ways, and I'll give one example here. Salafi jihadis attributed in their text infallibility to jihadists, a power that only superhuman figures such as prophets could claim. In doing so, Salafi jihadists removed jihadists from the earthly realm of learning and erudition, a sphere monopolized by scholars, and placed them in the domain of the metaphysical. Hence, they extricated the jihadists from the scrutiny of and comparison to scholars and simultaneously positioned them to garner public admiration by virtue of their alleged mystic powers, such as divine guidance and immunity from mistakes. Similarly, Salafi jihadists in the text they produced attributed to their martyrs the ability to perform miracles. They described the mujahideen as having awarded divine knowledge in the battlefield, knowledge that cannot be obtained in the madrasa or any learning or environment. And they depict martyrs as having been committed to a level of piety which supersede greatly that which is required by Islamic law to be a pious Muslim. These and other methods enable Salafi jihadis to reinforce their own image as extra pious and at times as superhuman, so to trigger public admiration and garner public support despite the scholars' condemnation of their actions. In today's presentation, I would like to discuss another literary device used by Salafi jihadis to enhance their religious charisma and thus to garner social support. My findings are based on the examination of various religious texts, such as sermons, articles, biographical dictionaries of Salafi jihadi martyrs, which members of Al-Qaeda placed on the internet. Biographical dictionaries of martyrs are not simply texts describing the lives of martyrs, but are narratives which reconstruct the martyr's life and death experiences, thereby casting an archetype of piety and martyrdom that others are expected to emulate. And in fact, those texts are sometimes recited as passages from the Quran and given or looked upon in great esteem by parts of society. In the attempt to reinforce the public perception of Salafi jihadis martyrs as authoritative figures and to increase their social appeal, the texts I study blur the line between martyrdom and asceticism. These two categories are usually treated in Islamic text as distinct moral and ethical ideals, even if there is some overlap in their characteristics. Asceticism is motivated mainly by a concern for the individual's ascetic spiritual state, and its goal is to help the ascetic attain the highest level possible, highest level of spirituality or spiritual level possible in this world. The ascetic's focus is internal, centering on his spiritual being. Since the ascetic perceives everyday life as inherently corrupting, he strives to subdue his worldly desires and to minimize his dependence on possession. In renouncing the outside world, or at least minimizing contact with it, the ascetic hopes to ensure that his soul does not succumb to materialism, instead remains devoted to God. Islamic martyrdom, in contrast, is typically focused on and motivated by an intense concern for the state of the world. Many modern radical Islamic texts, including the biographies of martyrs, and also sermons and legal writings, depict acts of martyrdom as focused on and intended to achieve mainly results that are external to the martyr himself. These texts describe people who choose to fight and die for the sake of God, fi sabilillah, as imbued with a sense of responsibility to the world outside themselves. Martyrs embrace martyrdom because they feel duty-bound to purge the world of corruption, moral decay, oppression, and so on and so forth. To submit the world to Islam and its ordinance, this is one of the big goals of global jihad today. Interestingly, in the past 2 decades or so, Salafi-Jihadi writings have increasingly been presenting self-sacrifice for the sake of God, meaning martyrdom, as an act focused on improving one's spiritual being, like asceticism. Those Salafi-Jihadi biographies do not depict martyrs as lacking any external motivations for their actions. They progressively portray martyrs' willingness to sacrifice their lives as stemming from ascetic concerns. I'll give a few examples. In some recent texts and visuals created by leading Salafi-Jihadi figures, the notion of martyrdom as serving external purpose is almost completely eclipsed by a different concept, i.e. martyrdom, as a test of one's true faith in and love for God. Here, Muslims are instructed to embrace martyrdom for internal and, in fact, selfish goals. In a text titled, "How Can You Outdo Muslim Scholars?" the writer states, "Jihad and martyrdom are the best test to distinguish the one who is a true friend of Allah from the one who pretends to be Allah's friend. The true friend sacrifices his soul and property for the sake of his Lord, thus drawing near to God by his sacrifice." The short clip we're about to watch reinforces this notion of martyrdom not as serving external purpose, but selfish goals. In this clip, Anwar al-Awlaki, the man here, the mentor of the 2 infamous terrorists, this Nigerian who attempted to blow up the airplane over Detroit in 2009, and also the other terrorist is the Fort Hood shooter in 2009. So Anwar al-Awlaki describes to his audience one of the earliest cases of martyrdom in Islam. He narrates the following story. In early Muslim battles against the Romans, Abdullah ibn Hudhafa, one of the earliest companions of the Prophet Muhammad, fell captive. Now, this is a lesson, of course, to people who believe in his ideology, of course. The Roman emperor, who heard great things about the unique characteristics of the Prophet Muhammad, Muhammad's companions, wished Abdullah to marry his daughter, but demanded that he convert to Christianity first. Abdullah refused to give up Islam, so the emperor offered him half of his kingdom if he converts. Abdullah persisted in his refusal. In his anger, the emperor ordered to bring a big container, to fill it with oil and boil it, and to throw into it a Muslim captive, another one, in front of Abdullah's eyes in order to scare him and cause him to cave in. Let's watch just 2 minutes of it, the rest of the story.
Oil just with smoke coming out of it, because they set it on fire for so long that it was boiling. And then they bring one of the Muslims and they throw him in that boiling oil. The narrator said, it wasn't very long after that Muslim was thrown in the boiling water that his bones started sticking out. It is so hot that his flesh was fried, the bones came out. You know when you fry, if you take for example chicken and you fry it, the bone sticks out because the flesh shrinks. It loses all of the water vapor in it and it shrinks. So the bone sticks out. That is what happened to this Muslim prisoner of war. And that was occurring in front of the eyes of Abdullah bin Hudhafa. So the king told him, are you going to give up your religion now? Otherwise, we're going to throw you in that boiling oil. He said, I'm not going to give up my religion. So they said, throw him in that oil. They picked him up. Abdullah started to cry. They went to the king and said, he's crying. The king said, bring him back. He's crying, he has weakened. He has weakened. We got him. We struck fear in his heart. Bring him to me. He said, all right, are you ready to give up your religion? Abdullah said, don't think that I cried because of fear of death. But the reason I cried is because I remember that I only have one soul. And my soul is going to leave now. So the reason I cried is because I wanted Allah to give me 100 souls so that I could die this death 100 times for the sake of Allah. I wasn't crying because I was afraid of death. I was crying because I wanted to die as a shaheed 100 times. In another narration he said, I wanted to have souls as the number of hair that I have on my skin, so that I could give them for the sake of Allah one after another. I think that's a level of iman that we can't even think about. We can't even comprehend.
Iman is belief.
Allahu Akbar. And that tells you, brothers and sisters, this religion is not a religion of talk. It's not a religion of showing off how much knowledge you have. This religion is about your willingness to sacrifice for Allah Azza wa Jal.
Here, the willingness to sacrifice the soul is portrayed as motivated not by the wish to promote Islam in the world, but by the desire to display one's love for God and show one's highest level of spirituality. In a way, this is similar to the ascetic whose willingness to renounce material and to desert worldly life is driven by the desire to enhance spirituality and draw near God. Another manifestation for the fusion of martyrdom and asceticism in Salafi-Jihadi text is found in martyrs' biographies. Online biographies depict martyrs as having chosen a path of martyrdom because they feared materialism and because they disdained the world. For example, one martyr is said to have despised the lowliness of this world and aspired to meet his Lord. Another martyr is said to have been proud, to have released himself from the chains of wealth, and to have gone to the gardens of the caves. And by the way, there are many martyrs, Saudi martyrs, who came from very rich families. Yet another martyr is said to have found this world burdensome, and thus he wished to meet his Lord. In addition to citing ascetic motivation for martyrdom, Salafi-Jihadi's texts also present martyrs as partaking in actual practices of asceticism, both mild and extreme, and even bestow on some martyrs the title, the ascetic, a zahid. Martyrs are often described as retiring from society for limited or extended period. I quote, he liked withdrawing from society, unquote, and as applying themselves zealously to the service of God in the mosque, known in Arabic, i'tikaf, and as, quote, secluding themselves for an hour while reciting the Quran, invoking the name of God and crying, unquote. Many martyrs are depicted as fasting twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays, and as individuals who renounce comfortable life and embraced instead asceticism and jihad. Yet some martyrs are said to have left penniless after renouncing their entire possession, to the point that their kids used to cry themselves to sleep out of hunger, unquote. Clearly, in this saying, the martyr figures and the ascetic are completely fused. Some texts portray the battlefield as an ideal realm of asceticism. In it, jihadists are completely removed from materialistic temptation, and thus they can more easily subdue their carnal desires. There, they can more effectively wash away these sins and reach the highest level of purity. He had begun, this is another quote, he had begun looking for a place that could wash away his sins and accept his repentance. Furthermore, since life in the battlefield has very limited connection to independence on material needs, besides the very, very basic, and since there, Life can end at any moment. It is presented in the text or some text as a sphere which is best conducive to attaining high level of spirituality. In sum, I do not claim here that Salafi-Jihadis invented the link which did not previously exist in Islamic tradition between asceticism and martyrdom. In fact, the Quran, the prophetic tradition, and many other Islamic sources point to such connection, either implicit or explicit connections. Rather, my point is that Salafi jihadists accentuated or even exaggerated the connection between asceticism and martyrdom to the point of rendering them, at times, one and the same. Hence, by amplifying the link between martyrdom and asceticism, and by implying that martyrs are in fact ascetics, Salafi jihadi texts place adherents of the Salafi jihadi creed in a territory which is much less politically charged and much less controversial, particularly, but not only, in Saudi Arabia. Moreover, they positioned jihadists in a safe sphere, which, as Islamic history indicates, generates tremendous social admiration and at times sheer veneration. As ascetics, jihadists could be perceived by the ordinary Muslims as highly pious people whose spirituality supersedes that of even most erudite scholars. With a jihadist's charisma blustered, Salafi jihadis could more easily boost their religious legitimacy and authority despite the Salafi scholars' condemnation of their actions. With their charisma-based authority, Salafi jihadis can more easily increase membership in the ranks, receive logistical and financial support from society, bypass traditional authorities, and redefine the boundaries of legitimate jihad by eliminating the legal constraints imposed by traditional scholarship. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eli, for keeping the time and for your very clearly represented insights. Let me confirm them with a few words from the Prophet. The asceticism of this nation, of this ummah, is jihad. So the Prophet confirmed what you said. And let us now move to our last speaker, Professor Meir Litvak. He is a professor at the Department of Middle Eastern History and director of the Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. Among the books he authored and edited are Shi'i Scholars of 19th Century Iraq, From Empathy to Denial, Arab Responses to the Holocaust, and Palestinian Collective Memory and National Identity. Professor Litvak has published numerous articles on the history of Iran and on modern Islamic movements, including Hamas. He will now speak about the place of martyrdom in the ideology of Hamas.
Thank you very much. Before I start, let me say one comment unrelated to our panel. The Middle East is in upheaval, but the old Middle East has not disappeared. It's still with us. Now, I will open with a saying. Allah is its target, the Prophet is its model, the Quran is its constitution, jihad is its path, and death for the sake of Allah is the loftiest of its wishes. This statement, first coined by Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, is inserted in Article 8 of the Hamas Charter, the canonical document of Hamas. It marks the transformation which took place in December 1987 of the Palestinian Muslim Brothers from a religious social movement into a political military one. The statement reflects an attempt to elevate the concept of jihad of the sword, into one of the pillars of Palestinian identity and into a major source of mobilization behind the movement and of national empowerment. According to Hamas, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not merely a territorial dispute between Palestinians and Israel. It is first and foremost a war of religion and faith between Islam and Judaism and between Muslims and Jews. As such, it is portrayed as an unbridgeable dichotomy between two opposing absolutes, as a historical, religious, and cultural conflict between faith and disbelief, between the true religion that superseded all previous religions, that is Islam, and the abrogated, superseded religion, that is Judaism. It is a war between good, personified by Muslims, representing the party of God, Hizballah, and evil, epitome of evil, the party of Satan, Hizb al-Shaitan, represented by the Jews. Consequently, the conflict is considered as an existential battle rather than a dispute over borders. Ma'arakat wujud wala hudud. While Hamas is a modern Islamic movement, it makes a great effort to ground its concept of jihad in the teachings of the great scholars of traditional Islam in order to acquire greater religious legitimacy and respectability. Islamic legal doctrine recognizes two types of jihad of the sword. The first is offensive jihad, whose goal is to expand the territory ruled by Islamic law and justice in places previously governed by governed the infidel law and moral corruption. The supreme goal of this type of jihad is the affirmation of Islam's moral superiority over other religions. The other type is defensive jihad, when a non-Muslim enemy occupies a territory that belonged to the abode of Islam, Dar al-Islam, and where God's laws had been practiced. In this case, it is incumbent upon the Muslims to restore the territory back to Islamic rule, regardless of the period of time which may have elapsed since the loss of this territory until the end of time. Like all other Islamic movements, Hamas regards the jihad against Israel as defensive jihad for two reasons. The first is what it sees as the usurpation of Palestine and the dispossession of its inhabitants, the Muslim Palestinians, by the Zionists. In this perspective, Zionism is viewed as the latest and most faithful phase of the relentless onslaught waged by the West against Islam since the 11th century Crusades. The second reason is the war which Hamas claims the Jews have waged against Islam in order to eliminate it, or at least denigrate it, since the times of the Prophet Muhammad. In the eyes of Hamas, the 1967 war, or Israeli capture of Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the third holiest site in Islam, combines both of these elements. Islamic law views offensive jihad as a collective duty which requires only a sufficient number, though unspecified number, of Muslims to take part in it in order for the entire Muslim community to have fulfilled its duty. But since the struggle against the Jews is defined as defensive jihad, it becomes an individual duty, wajib ayn, incumbent upon every able-bodied Muslim. Here Hamas adopts the position of Abdullah Azam, the radical Palestinian thinker and ideological mentor of Osama bin Laden and of the transnational jihadi movement, who asserts that any land that was once under Muslim rule but was subsequently lost to the infidels should be restored to Islam only through jihad, as an individual duty of every Muslim. Moreover, in light of the loss of Palestine and the resultant necessity of jihad, Hamas adopts the ruling of Ibn Taymiyyah of the 14th century, which was further elaborated in the modern period by Abdullah Azam. This view elevates jihad into one of the central pillars, Arkan al-Islam, second only to the statement of Shahada, and even preceding prayer and pilgrimage to Mecca. Thus, Ahmad Bahar, former deputy speaker of the Palestinian Legislative Council, expressed his amazement, if not open disappointment, at the fact that Muslims who devoutly practice the duties of prayer and fasting neglect the duty of jihad in spite of the many explicit references to it in the Quran. In view of the attacks of the Muslim world, and citing, he cites the Quran, Surah 9, Repentance, verse 36, end of the Hadith, Bahar concluded that whoever dies without taking part in jihad has died a jahili death. That is a death of a barbarian or ignorant pre-Islamic period. In other words, he made jihad the essence of the believer's life. Meir stated that the motif of national self-sacrifice, fida, was intertwined with the religious martyrdom, istishhad, as a necessary step in the effort to rehabilitate the Palestinian people following the 1948 defeat. And it became a broad semantic reservoir familiar to all Palestinians regardless of their ideological inclination. The notion of self-sacrifice was familiar to the Muslim Brothers already in the 1940s. In an article dedicated to this concept, Hassan al-Banna coined the term the craft of death, sinat al-maut, stating that a nation familiar with the art of death, or with sinat al-maut, and that knows how to die an honorable death, will be bestowed by Allah a glorified life on earth and eternal pleasure in the hereafter. While drawing heavily on earlier Islamic tradition and concepts of martyrdom, Hamas elevates it into a supreme value as the epitome of a jihad and as an object of personal and collective aspiration for the Palestinians. The blood of the shuhada, or the martyrs, has always served as the fuel of jihad, of resistance and of liberation, and as a light which illuminates the way in the darkness of oppression, wrote an anonymous Hamas editor for a collection of articles on the status of martyrdom in Islam. In a similar vein, Ahmed Baher states that jihad will not be accomplished unless the eyes of the holy warrior turn toward paradise rather than toward earthly goals. Scholars disagree as to the direct cause which led Hamas to launch suicide operations. Some consider the trigger to have been the massacre of 29 Palestinians in Hebron by Baruch Goldstein on February 25, 1994. However, as early as 1992, a Hamas publication extolled suicide attacks and predicted that they would be carried out as soon as the technical capability would become available. It should also be noted that the first suicide attack, albeit against military target, took place in April 16, 1993, prior to the Oslo Accords and to the Hebron massacre. The ideological motivation for suicide bombings had therefore been constructed well before 1994 and had primarily religious justification. The push toward action came as a result of political developments, mainly, in my view, the progress in those days of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and the increasing sense of threat to the movement and its chances of pursuing its ideological strategic goals. Hamas officials reject the argument that suicide attacks harm the Palestinian cause and assert instead that the excessive concessions made by the Palestinians in the negotiations with Israel stem from the absence of such a leverage. They consider past failures of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, which was partly, again in my view, due to suicide attacks, as a positive development since it ended harmful Palestinian commitments. While Hamas spokesmen concede that the Palestinians suffer heavier casualties than the Israelis, they insist that the Palestinians demonstrated greater perseverance and morale than the Israelis and were more capable of sustaining higher casualties. They reject the charges that martyrdom operations were tantamount to the collective suicide of the Palestinian people and point to the successful struggle carried out by Hezbollah in Lebanon, which, despite causing heavy casualties to the Lebanese population, forced Israel to withdraw unilaterally from Lebanon in the year 2000. While martyrdom operations led to the collapse of the Israeli army in Lebanon, they enhanced the morale of the Palestinians and enabled them to continue their jihad. According to Hamas writers, the greatest advantage enjoyed by the Palestinians over the Israelis, in this case, derives from the different perception of death in the two societies. Israel is a materialistic, hedonistic Western society that views this world as its end goal and is extremely sensitive to the loss of human life, while the Palestinians and Hamas in particular, according to their self-description, represent a religious society that regards this world as merely an entry to eternal life in paradise. Exploiting this crucial difference, Hamas promoted the cult of death as an ideal and as the epitome of the believer's aspiration. The phenomenon of martyrdom in the occupied Palestinian territories, explains one Hamas writer, Dr. Yusuf Rizka, constitutes an important component of the wise return to Islam. Religion in Islam is more powerful than life, and the harm caused to the Muslim's faith is considered greater than the harm caused to his body, child, or property. The true believer knows that an honorable life can be attained only through martyrdom. Hamas asserts that the path to happiness for the present generation is through martyrdom, not life. And had the Palestinians fully understood the grace which God awarded them through martyrdom, they would have thanked God for opening the gates of martyrdom to those who defend his religion. The Israelis crave life, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin explained. While we are not afraid of death, we seek death for the sake of God. And the day one of us dies for the sake of God is a day of joy and happiness for us all. All Hamas publications have promoted the ideal of martyrdom and the culture of death, with a visible correlation between the improvement of Hamas' combative capabilities and the promotion of martyrdom as a noble idea and as the object of yearning or even passion. Hamas published books commemorating the lives and deeds of prominent martyrs, and in its written and electronic media has disseminated elaborate eulogies on each suicide bomber, detailing the operation in which the martyr was killed and the casualties inflicted upon the enemy. Each eulogy cites the Quranic passage which states that those who sacrifice themselves for God are not really dead, but remain alive in heaven. Pictures of suicide bombers have been distributed as posters, often accompanied by the statement that the act of martyrdom represents the betrothal of the martyr with the land of Palestine. More significantly, perhaps, the Hamas children magazine, Al-Fatih, features in each issue the story of the life and death of a martyr, as well as the will he signed before his death. In most such wills, the suicide bombers urge their families and friends to rejoice at their coming martyrdom and follow their example. Children who participate in popular Hamas children TV programs spoke of their wish to die as martyrs when they grow up, while the program's hero, a Palestinian Mickey Mouse called Farfour, presents a model to the children by ending his life in a suicide operation. Participants in Hamas rallies sometimes dress their children up as suicide bombers with simulated explosive belts strapped to their bodies as a demonstration of their readiness to sacrifice their children for the struggle. Echoing these sentiments, a mother of a Hamas suicide bomber, and here I don't care if she really meant it or she was forced to say it, the fact that it was shown on TV, stated in an interview, "I'm a compassionate mother to my children. Because I love my son, I encourage him to die a martyr's death for the sake of Allah. Jihad is a religious obligation incumbent upon us, and we must carry it out. I sacrifice Muhammad as part of my obligation." Basing themselves on the passage that says, "Count not those who were slain in God's way as dead, but rather living with their God." Again, Surah 3, Ayah 169. Hamas writers extol the bounties bestowed on God by God on martyrs, which greatly surpass those he gives to believers in this world. Particular emphasis, as Anat Berko has mentioned, is attributed to the 72 dark-eyed virgins that await the future martyrs in paradise and may serve as a compensation for the sexual repression prevalent among young men in a conservative Muslim society. In the view of Palestinian-American sociologist Hisham Sharabi, such repression produces an almost obsessive preoccupation with sexuality. As a result, young Muslim men have taken the promise of the 72 dark-eyed virgins quite literally. When asked why he did not marry, one young suicide bomber's answer, "Why should I forsake the dark-eyed to marry a woman of clay," that is of blood and flesh and blood. While a 16-year-old Hamas youth activist in Gaza confessed to an American reporter that most boys in my class or my group cannot stop thinking about the virgins. The emphasis placed on self-sacrifice and on the benefits and pleasures that await future martyrs most likely reflects a genuine belief. It also serves to overcome basic human instincts that are opposed to the cult of death and helps to rationalize the high Palestinian casualties incurred by the conflict with Israel, presenting them as a positive achievement instead of as a source of pain. The culture of martyrdom and death produced macabre linguistic turnarounds, as in Abdelaziz al-Rantisi statement equating martyrdom to the industry of life, or Bahar assertions that martyrdom is life of heroism and valor. Such statements are reminiscent of the slogan "Viva Muerta, long live death," coined by the fascist colonel Milan Astray during the Spanish Civil War. While there are many fundamental differences between fascism and contemporary radical Islamic movements, the glorification of violence and death is something that they both have in common. Like most other Sunni movements, Hamas has relegated the messianic element of Islam to a secondary level, for it has been much more interested in establishing an Islamic state in the here and now. The one exception is the eschatological meaning given by Hamas to the jihad against the Jews, which it claims is a prerequisite for fulfilling God's promise to establish his rule over the earth. The resort to messianic symbolism may have stemmed from the particular predicament endured by the Palestinians since 1948, or was designed to stave off calls for compromise with Israel. Citing the tradition of the Saltbush, or Hadith al-Gharkad, or Wad al-Shajar wa-Hajar, that is the promise of the stone, of the tree and the stone, the Hamas charter states that the final hour will not come until the day when the Muslims will fight the Jews and kill them. A preacher of Hamas on Al-Aqsa TV in as late as 2009 explained that the Jews in Israel plant trees all over the country in order to hide behind them when the day of judgment will come and will kill them all. Various Hamas writers have tried to explain the full meaning of this statement. Thus, Salah al-Khalidi, a frequent contributor to Palestine al-Muslima, said that following the complete liberation of Palestine, the Jews will first return to the status of a dispersed, humiliated minority among the nations, and in the second phase, all the Jews of the world will be exterminated, and humanity will be relieved of their presence, since subsequently not one Jew will remain alive. Writing in the Hamas organ Al-Risala, Kan'an Ubaid stated that suicide operations are necessary so that the people will know that the extermination of the Jews is good for the inhabitants of all the world. As a mass movement with clear political aspirations to lead the Palestinian people, Hamas always had to operate in the context of opportunities and constraints, of conflicting interest and cost-benefit considerations, and is attentive to the fluctuating needs and desires of the Palestinian population, and it is also cognizant of power and political feasibility. Moreover, following the violent takeover of Gaza, of the Gaza Strip in June 2007, Hamas was forced to balance between its ideology and the practical needs and constraints of a government. Hamas developed creative solutions designed to bridge between its ideological commitment and practical necessities. One such solution was the idea of Hudna, which has been dealt excessively, so I will not refer to it. And the other one is the concept of mukawama, of resistance, or a long-term, long of attrition, which may include short periods of ceasefire necessary for rebuilding Palestinian fighting capabilities. While the political fortunes of Hamas have changed significantly, its basic ideology in advocating the elimination of Israel and the establishment of a Palestinian state over the entire territory of Palestine has remained consistent. And while differences over tactics have emerged among Hamas leaders since its electoral victory, the consensus around its ideology appears to have remained unchanged. Many ideological movements are forced to compromise once they attain power, but the distance which they can take is influenced and often constrained by their basic worldview. Hamas is no exception. It has continued to promote the jihadi discourse and has refused to cross certain ideological red lines, even when it was forced to follow a more pragmatic path in its day-to-day conduct. In other words, even if ideology is not the sole factor guiding Hamas actions, it is still an important one. Thank you.
When in early 7th century the Arab won astounding victories over the Byzantines, the emperor asked one of his officers, how come these people from the desert win such victories? And the answer was, because they love death more than we love life. يُحِبُّونَ الْمَوْتِ كَمَا نُحِبُّ الْحَيَاةِ. So you have your confirmation again from very early Islamic sources. I feel somewhat ridiculous to thank you for such a grim picture you painted, but thank you for this illuminating talk and for keeping the time. We have now time for a few questions. If anyone would like to address a question to any of the panelists, feel free to do so.
Hello. This is a general question towards all three of you. My question is, do all elements of Muslim society view jihad in the same way? Do they all interpret the meaning of martyrdom in the same general direction? This is basically the question. They have the same concept of the word jihad, holy war, martyrdom, etc.
I can tell you just that Sheikh Ahmed Yassin told me that jihad is also when you go and work hard to provide for your children. It's also jihad. So it's not just jihad as a war, as a holy war. It's also there are many other meanings of jihad.
Well, very briefly, 1.3 billion Muslims cannot be in full agreement on one point. Obviously, no. Obviously there are different views and opinions about jihad. Unfortunately, here I would say there's a large enough number of people, or too large a number of people that believes in this what's jihad of the sword and in the ideas of martyrdom. Unfortunately, very often in history, a small number of people can cause a lot of harm, even though they may be only 10% of 1.3 billion people, or even less.
Just one comment, and we have to bear in mind that when we talk about seeking death, that Islam is very much invested in this world too, just as much as Judaism and some of the other religions. So, yes, a lot of what you heard here today can or is informed by some sources, modern or classical, but it's very, very useful to look at to contextualize it and to look at the specific and how particular society in particular conditions uses and the sources and interpret the sources. So to answer the question is, I don't think everybody think the same, even though they are drawing or on the same sources. They might choose to highlight different things in different time, and this is our job to look at the specifics, the particular society.
How did I arrange the meetings? Okay, it's I have the whole chapter in my new book, The Smarter Bomb. Actually, you have to go with empathy to those people and to look at them as human beings without, even after you look at their files and you see what they did, horrible things, and to put aside religion, politics, and not to argue, to be able to conduct a conversation, pure conversation from heart to heart, and to try to figure out what is common to all of us. I can give you an example. I'm from Iraqi origin. So we spoke a lot about my origin. And I found myself speaking with Sheikh Abu Ter, and he told me, you know, your father is very good. You're well educated. The Iraqis are the best in the education. He couldn't see me as Jewish. After long conversation, he looked at me as Iraqi woman sitting with him and talking about a lot of things. The other thing is to try to understand their childhood, their life, ordinary life, not just terrorism. They will jump to this subject, but we need to give them hands to move forward slowly, slowly, not to go directly to those, and all the mujamalat and the greetings and the way how to communicate, and not to come with our watch and to say time is money, I'm running. For me, it's like 15 years inside prison without getting any parole.
Any more questions?
I kind of wanted to ask about the role of dehumanization. We've discussed a lot here, almost a zero-sum ideological game of where it's, I guess, Islam versus the world, especially in this extremist view. But you brought up the idea of dehumanization, of getting individuals to look at either Christians or Jews or somebody else as people rather than as a target or a victim. And I was wondering what recommendations or what processes are involved with trying to get from that point of a zero-sum game to seeing people as people.
To try to shatter this divide, there is a splitting that we saw also. We can find it in the Ku Klux Klan. We found it in the Nazis' behavior. How to be able to shatter this divide? And you can shatter this divide when you come to their families, speaking about their families. Actually, when I conducted my PhD research, and I compared in moral judgment between the dispatchers of suicide bombers of the First Intifada to ordinary criminals, murderers, and petty criminals, all of whom Arabs. And I asked them many questions. I gave them pictures of children, my children. And after the second session about their own families, their own mothers, something really moved. It's a short-term influence, but this is the direction. And if you want to think in operative meaning, a lot of psychological warfare to understand what is the inside world of those people, and you can make a change if you know how to use psychological warfare. Many times I think that the Western world doesn't know how to do it.
I want to thank you for a very interesting lecture. Just to add something, study of the letter of Muhammad Atta to the other suicide bombers by the late psychoanalyst Ruth Stein. She was an Israeli psychoanalyst who lived in New York, and she pointed out the tremendous amount of longing for the father there was in that letter, because he kept mentioning Allah and how you're going to be with Allah and live with Allah and be loved by Allah. So there is in the suicide bomber also a very deep longing for the father. And I think you mentioned that sometimes there's a weak father and sometimes there's a confused identity, and sometimes these people are borderline people. So it's very, it goes very well along with this explanation, this longing for the father, which is part of that act and the fantasies about being with Allah. And the other aspect, which is very dramatic, is the fact that by committing suicide murder, the suicide bomber actually kills himself along with the other people that he is killing at the same time. So there is a kind of fusion or merger with the people that he is killing, which should make us think about what it is that he is really longing to merge with. Thank you very much.
And for the women, this merge, sometimes people speak about sexual relationship after the death of a female suicide bomber, for example. And if you spoke about Muhammad Atta, he also asked for that to his grave, women wouldn't come, especially pregnant women. A lot of sexuality there, and he was a very introverted person, and he couldn't express himself. He didn't have any relationship with women, and he dedicated himself to Islam because he couldn't find any social, real connection to other people.
Yeah.
Unless I'm mistaken, there seems to have been a drop-off in the number of the suicide bombings in the recent years. I'd like to know if that's the case and how this has come about and what the effect is on this whole philosophy.
Yes, obviously there's been a decline in the number of suicide bombers, but in my view it's a result of operational failures. It is the successful efforts of both the Israeli security services and the Palestinian Authority. It's not because of the lack of desire, ambition, but it's the difficulties of operations. And this is in my view. Now, it has not changed the ideology. The cultivation of these ideas still remains. It is not operated because either they try to operate through other means.
I want to take it from a slightly different point of view. Suicide, like anything else, has a social function, like any other social phenomenon. So it might be that the same society will use and promote this notion and then tailor texts or pick and choose from the text of their own religion to promote this phenomenon, and then another time keep it low and may keep the rhetoric, but for operational or tactical reason, not use it, or completely afterwards, maybe when one time Hamas will roll, if this thing will happen and they roll and they have full government, full-fledged government, they might need it anymore, and then we might see the rhetoric change completely. So it's not a static phenomenon. It's something, it's very dynamic, and it's affected by what they're trying to achieve, conditions, and they definitely can change it.
I can tell you what failed suicide bombers told me. The security fence can prevent and save life. They cannot just walk with an explosive belt and blow themselves up in the Israeli cities. And the Shin Bet, the Shabak. Both of them, because the motivation is there. And I don't want to predict, but in the future to come, we can see also suicide bombers in Egypt, in part of the revolution, used as a tool, as a weapon. It's a weapon, and it is contagious phenomenon.
So a very brief question, do you see that the attraction of martyrdom and all this ideology has been affected by the recent events, by the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, and how all these people that are taking back their lives through political means are affecting an example for the people that were believing that there was no other way out beforehand, or not?
Do you want me to answer? Okay, whoever.
I think it's too early to say. I don't think we have perspective. I would say two things. You can argue that if Egypt will move toward greater democracy, pluralism, etc., obviously the attraction of radical Islamic movements will decline. That is, of the Salafi-Jihadi type, the attraction for them will decline, and then what you say will be correct. On the other hand, what happens in Egypt does not necessarily affect the Palestinians. In that regard, that it would solve their problem. And you can say that as long as the Palestinian problem persists, and as long as the Palestinians continue to perceive themselves as wronged, etc., the danger that this motivation will survive will continue.
Again, if we talk about the social function of martyrdom, so we have to again look at the specific phenomenon, at the specific group or place. In the case of Salafi-Jihadi, not necessarily. If anything, anything that brings democracy and promote democracy in the Middle East will only push them to commit more, or to send more suicide bombers, or to commit more act of martyrdom. If we talk about a religious change within Egypt, or moving towards, instead of democracies, to religious society or religious type of regime, political Islam, this might, in a way, subside or cause the phenomenon to subside. But it's hard to know. I mean, we really have to look at a particular context.
If there are no more questions, we will thank the panel, and the next session will be at 4:45. Thank you.